Right. Can you see that?
Yes.
It says lightning talk. Okay, great. So this is just going to be a taster on something that I've discovered in the recent times. So there's not really enough time. So let me just start with the key point. So many Agile practitioners are, I believe, unwittingly constraining the performance of their Agile team and organizations. And so how do I know this? Well, it's something that I've done. And so I just wanted to share with you in the next few minutes how I came to this conclusion. And before I do so, I just wanted to give you a bit of a context to my Agile journey, because different people will be taking a different path. And by knowing some of the context of some of the thinking that has shaped me, you might be able to see some parallels in your path and potentially, make some changes if you think there's value in what I have to say. So if I just go to my timeline. So that's me there. I basically went to university in the days of RAD, the Rapid Applications Development. I went to university where I studied engineering and some business studies, finishing off in 1991. And that was Cape Town University in South Africa. You can most probably hear from my accent. Following that, I did some software development as a researcher in an industrial and scientific research institute. My first real job was with Siemens in industrial automation, automating things like BMW car factories for the BMW 3 Series, which get manufactured in South Africa. Now, that was also the time that DSDM was started. Now, I wasn't aware of it, but you'll see in a few minutes that did shape my thinking. We also had the first sort of Scrum paper being published, the Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber paper. And for me, sort of the big excitement started with the internet, playing around with Mosaic, one of the first browsers. And then I got involved in a couple of startups, and that was really interesting and shaped my sort of Agile thinking, because these were fast-growing organizations, lots of new people joining, lots of immature technologies, and customers who didn't really know what they wanted either. So I was asked to explore how we could go about organizing ourselves. And DSDM is one of the approaches that I found that worked very well in our situation. I'm sure most of you who have got a few gray hairs will recognize the rational unified process, and that was pretty big in the early 2000s. I also stumbled across the XP way of programming, which was pretty good. And then in 2001, we had our Agile Manifesto. I started doing some coaching. I met Eli Goldratt. And Eli Goldratt, for those of you who don't know, is essentially the guy who came up with the theory of constraints. We had the Poppendics writing the Lean Software Development book, an Agile toolkit. And I've been doing freelance consulting, coaching since about 2004. I did my certified Scrum Master with Ken Schwaber in 2006. My first really super duper deluxe Agile Dream Team was using XP. We were using Scrum. We were using user experience, researching, prototyping, continuous integrations, test-driven development. So I must say that is an experience that I still hold very dear to my heart. And most of us from that time are still in touch. I did some more studying around constraints management and theory of constraints at Washington State University. Kanban really starts to come to a forefront the late 2000s. And nowadays, very big is safe, less. And I've been working primarily in very large enterprises of late since about 2013. And then most recently, I have been very enamored by what I read in Steve Tendon's books on TameFlow. And the first of the TameFlow books was published in 2013. And the most recent one was published this year. So you can see I've been using Agile for quite some time. Agile is very much mainstream, and as a freelance coach, Scrum Masters and coaches are now commonplace. There are Agile experts a dime a dozen. So one of the challenges I faced is that, so as a commoditized Agile practitioner, how do I distinguish myself from the rest? And I went back to my TOC sort of experiences to try and sort of go back to basics, go back to the fundamentals. And one of the things that really struck me in some of the work that Steve spoke about in TameFlow is how a common practice of limiting work in progress actually limits the performance of our teams when you get to lift the hood on it. So what does everyone do? So pretty much everyone, and if you do a search on Google for, let's say, Kanban column whip limits, you'll come up with pictures that show you column whip limits. It's really easy to do. You put a number at the top of the column, you agree on how many work items are to be, what's the maximum number of work items in a particular column. So to try and make the concept I'm trying to explain a little bit easier for you to deal with, I'd like you to think of a hose pipe. Here's a hose pipe. And now what we're trying to do at a sort of a systems level is we're trying to increase the flow through our teams. So what limits the flow of water through that hose pipe? It's a bit of a rhetorical question because I'm just about to give you the answer. But there's a big kink in that hose pipe. There's a constraint in that hose pipe. So obviously we need to turn the tap on to get water to flow. But it's the kink, and there may be several kinks that are going to limit the flow of the water through your hose pipe. And so during last month's meetup that you had, Clark Ching spoke about the bottleneck rules. So most of you will already, be familiar with some of that thinking. And so that at any one point in time, a system will have one true constraint limiting the flow of work through that system, because otherwise, you would see unlimited outputs. And so this mental model is just a model. All models are, simplifications of the real world, but it's still a very useful thinking tool that we can use to help us come up with ways to improve the way we're working. So, just hang on to that concept. What I did is I created a simulator to help me understand this. So if you imagine, here's our pipe, it's now vertical. Our water particles flow through the pipe, and in an ideal world, they would just flow through unimpeded, right? And the question I want you to think about is what happens when we apply column whip limits at a team or, even at a portfolio level. And I'm going to go back to one of those Kanban images that we saw on Google. And in a moment, you'll see there's our constraint, our true constraint, and that constraint is limiting the flow of our work through the system. Now, let's just get that Kanban picture up. So there we go. And what I've done there is I have taken the column whip limits and I've just rotated them and squashed together to give you that idea of, or to give you an opportunity to think about this as a series of concentric pipes of different diameters. And that, in one sense, is what your whip limits are doing to the system. So if we take our simulator again, we can essentially put our column level whip limits onto the system. And then when we have our work, it will flow through those constraints. So here we go. And so the question is, will adding those WIP limits make any material impact on the constraint and on the flow through the constraint? Now, another way to think about this, coming back to the sort of analogy of water and hose pipes, consider there's your hose pipe lying on the garden. You want to find and take out the kink, but you've got a lot of very happy people jumping around on the hose pipe at their WIP limits, making it very difficult to find the kink. And if you don't focus your improvement efforts on that limiting constraint, by definition, you are not improving as much as you could. So you might be lucky, someone might jump on the kink and solve the problem for you, but there you're leaving it to chance. So I think that, there is some really good stuff in the tame flow approach to combining Agile and theory of constraints. And you'll see that when you read the tame flow books and you get involved in the tame flow community, that the process Steve has come up with uses what the Toyota production system originally used. You use tokens to limit the total flow of work items. You use average flow times per state to work out where your constraint is. You use buffers to protect the constraint. There's, I think a lot of really, really interesting ideas. And if you look at that timeline, it really is, I think, about time we sort of consider and explore new ideas, as Pete was saying, to improve the way in which we work. And obviously, I am looking for ways to improve the value that the teams I work with have and are delivering. And, this is really quite a community is growing up around this. I've teamed up with the head of Agile at Lloyd's Bank, and we are now going to offer some training on tame flow thinking. So I hope this has been a nice little taster to get you to consider that one of those very common practices may be limiting the performance of your teams when you dig a little bit deeper. So, any questions? I am now at 13 minutes, I believe.
I have a question. When you talk about buffer, is that like a queue? Is that what we're talking about? Place to hold things until it's processable or whatever.
Yes, it is a queue of sorts. Yes.
Okay.
So there will be, so based on the time that it takes for work to flow through the system, you will create a buffer. Now that buffer is more than just a queue. It actually acts as a signaling mechanism for you to be able to introduce new work to the team so that you don't flood the system. And you can do that through the use of the tokens. Now there's a lot of tame flow jargon and theory of constraints jargon in that. But yes, it is a queue, but it's more than just a traditional queue, if we can call it that.
Okay, gotcha.
Any other questions?
Question from me, sorry. It was just a follow-on from Phil's question, really. Is quite often, as we found out in the bottleneck rule, is QA deemed to be a bottleneck. Would you build a buffer in front of that so that particular amounts of work were going to QA at a singular time, or would you try to put that buffer as high up in the flow as possible?
You see, now you ask a very, very important question. Where's the constraint? And how do you find out where the constraint is?
Indeed.
And so do you see on the screen, I've got one of the key things that you learn in the tame flow approach. You look at the average flow time per state. And that average flow time is the tool that you can use to figure out where your constraint is. So remember, your constraint could change, and as you improve things, you may choose to move your constraint to different parts of the team. And then you can even get more meta about it, in the sense that someone chose a particular configuration for the teams and the way they work. And at some level, then the constraint is the thinking that created your system. But average flow times, that is sort of a big revelation for me. It actually becomes relatively simple to find your constraint when you know what you need to look for. And the problem is when you put column WIP limits into your system, you muck up your ability to work out what the average flow times are. So if you use column WIP limits, I'm afraid this approach won't work for you, because you essentially have all those people jumping around on the hose pipe, and you get a lot of noise in your system, and that limits your ability to improve.
Wow.
Okay, so
thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. And thanks for the great questions and answers there as well. We are running slightly behind schedule. So I suggest we have a 5-minute break now, and then we'll come back for Tracy's laughter yoga. So it's 7:37. So can we make it 7:42 to come back?
Sounds
Am
good.
I okay with that?
Sounds good. Yeah. Great stuff.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks for the lightning talks, everybody.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you.
Really good talks. Well done for those. See you all shortly.
Rudy, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Because I was thinking, because you have the WIP limits, and if you're sort of saying we're potentially removing WIP limits to sort of find the constraints, it would be then, how would you say, okay, is to manage, so you have the swarming happening to move things through, because otherwise potentially it'd be, oh, I'm stuck here, I'm just going to open another ticket, and because I'm not constrained by a WIP limit as such.
So very good question. So I think we both agree that reducing WIP is a good thing. And when you are, let's say, one of the things I see often is that when you've got column level WIP limits, you don't get swarming, because it's a bit like, well, it's in the other guy's column, or it's in that side's column. So swarming or alignment or whatever we call it, basically you want the whole team to focus on essentially like a relay runner. The button's coming, am I ready? I pick up the button and off I go. And so by not having any WIP limits, what you are doing is you're encouraging the whole team to effectively run a relay race. So whatever rules of the game the team can come up to move that button as quickly from start to finish is what the aim of the game is.
So would that be almost sort of getting to single piece flow, where it's just how many of the team can move that physically through to the end, to done?
Yes, and so as I alluded to, because you're basically constraining the total amount of work in the whole system, you basically make sure, and you can obviously, you have to work out where you're going to, how much stuff do you need to or can you have in flow at the same point in time. So because you are able to use your buffer as a way to control incoming work, you basically focus people's attention on improving flow across the whole system. And, so, that's why things can be improved so much more. But, in my old days, I was just doing what everyone else was doing, which was doing column WIP limits. And the reason, so it's a good idea. But I think one of the reasons why we have column WIP limits is because it's so easy to do. But when you actually look at, well, what is the reason for us limiting work in progress or work in process? And then you start to realize that there's actually alternative ways to do it. And there's a very interesting, I don't know if you've read David Anderson's blue book on Kanban.
I have a copy. It's in my my reading list at the moment.
Okay, so if you go and look near the front, he has a very, very interesting insight in there, which is a story of him in the Tokyo Imperial Gardens. I don't know if you've ever heard that story.
No, I'm just going to take a note so I can check that out.
Okay, so I remember reading this, and the insight he has is that this is a fantastic garden with a big wall around it with lots of gates, and the public, it's free, it's open to the public. But in order to have a relaxing, peaceful experience in the garden, you need to limit the number of people inside the gardens. And so when he went into the garden the first time around, everyone in his party was given a white token that said, please hand this token back to the gate when you leave. And so he went into the wonderful garden and had a lovely time. And then he left and he handed in the tokens. And then he realized later that each of the gates, they decide at the beginning of the day how many people they want to allow into the park. And they hand out a limited number of tokens to all the gatekeepers. And those tokens then effectively act as that WIP limit token to limit the amount of people in the garden so that their experience of the garden is at the optimal level for that time of the year. Now, the thing that I found a bit odd was that this story is in the book, but nowhere do I actually see that insight being actually applied to the way in which Kanban systems have been designed. So what Steve Tenden has done, he's actually, again, he's gone back to the Toyota thinking and Taichi Ono, where this Kanban thinking actually, shall we say, originates from, if there's any such thing as an original thought. There are obviously some people who have these ideas. And one of the key things around the Toyota Kanban approach to doing work is that it enables you to delegate decision-making in a very autonomous way, but it's a way to basically manage the whole system very effectively. So, this is something which I'm pretty excited about. And like I say, it's there are some very interesting developments in this space. And as I said, when I can get to team up with someone like, Jitesh, who's head of Agile at Lloyd's, there must be some legs to this thinking. And again, me as a consultant contractor, I don't know how many of you are, employed or contracting. Agile experts are a dime a dozen now.